Agatha Christie's Hidden Hercule Poirot Mystery Part 1. The letter that should not exist. Hercule Poirot disliked disorder. It offended him not merely as a Belgian, but as a man who believed the universe, like a well-balanced mustache, should possess symmetry, logic, and restraint. That morning in his Whitehaven mansion's flat, everything was precisely as it should be. The breakfast tray aligned perfectly with the edge of the table, the Times folded to the correct width, his patent leather shoes gleaming like black mirrors. Everything, that is, except the letter. It lay on the small round table beside the window, where Poirot was quite certain it had not been moments earlier. Poirot stood very still, his egg spoon suspended mid-air. His eyes, green, sharp, and unnervingly alive, fixed themselves upon the envelope. Cream-colored paper, thick, expensive, no stamp, and addressed in handwriting he knew far too well. H. Poirot, ESQ, Whitehaven Mansions, London. Poirot slowly placed the spoon down. "No," he murmured softly. "This is not possible." He crossed the room with deliberate steps, as though approaching a dangerous animal that might spring if startled. He lifted the envelope between thumb and forefinger. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his own. Every curve, every measured angle, every faint pressure at the end of a stroke, habits formed over decades and impossible to imitate perfectly. Poirot had once exposed a forger precisely because the man's imitation of his writing was too careless. This, however, was flawless. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. Poirot unfolded it. The letter was brief. "My dear Poirot, if you are reading this, then you have already made the first mistake. Do not involve the police. Do not tell Hastings. Above all, do not trust your memory. On the 17th of November, at precisely 9:40 p.m., a man will be murdered, though no body will ever be found. You will believe you have seen this before. You have not. This letter was written by you. H.P. dated the 22nd of November, 5 years from today." Poirot sat down very slowly. For a full minute, he did not move. His mind, those celebrated little gray cells, began their work, sorting sensation from deduction, shock from logic. 5 years in the future. Impossible. And yet. Poirot examined the paper again. The ink was fresh, the date precise, the warning disturbingly intimate. You will believe you have seen this before. Poirot closed his eyes. A faint pressure stirred. At the back of his mind, an echo of something half-remembered, like a tune heard in a dream and forgotten upon waking. He did not like it. Captain Hastings arrived shortly after noon, full of cheer, entirely unaware that the universe had tilted slightly off its axis. "My dear Poirot," he exclaimed, removing his hat, "you should have come down to the club last night. A ripping game of bridge, though I still say Colonel Westover cheats." Poirot smiled thinly. "Mon ami, tell me, have you ever received a letter from yourself?" Hastings blinked. "Well, no, can't say I have." Poirot nodded. "Just so." He did not show Hastings the letter. The warning echoed in his mind. Do not tell Hastings. Poirot trusted Hastings with his life. But trust, Poirot knew, was not the same as wisdom. And whoever had written that letter, whether himself or a madman, knew him well enough to understand that. They spoke of trivial things. Poirot asked questions that seemed idle but were not. Whether Hastings had noticed anyone unusual in the building, whether the porter had mentioned visitors, whether the post had been late. Nothing. The letter had appeared as though conjured from the air. After Hastings left, Poirot locked the letter in his desk drawer and sat very still. Time, he reflected, was a peculiar thing. People believed it marched forward in a straight line. Poirot had always suspected otherwise. The first death occurred 3 days later. Poirot read about it in the evening paper. Prominent financier declared dead. Nitrogen monoxide, body resevered. The name struck him like a blow. Edmund Vale. Poirot's fingers tightened on the paper. Vale was a man Poirot remembered clearly, or believed he did. A financier of considerable intelligence, ruthless charm, and an unsettling smile. Poirot had crossed paths with him once, many years ago, in a case that had ended. Oddly, the article stated that Vale had vanished from his country estate in Surrey. Blood had been found in his study. Signs of a violent struggle were evident, but no body. The time of death, according to witnesses? Approximately 9:40 p.m., Poirot folded the paper with meticulous care. So, he murmured, it begins. The Surrey estate was called Ashcombe House. It was a place that seemed to absorb sound, as though secrets had soaked into its walls over generations. Poirot arrived to find the household assembled like figures in a carefully arranged tableau. There was Mrs. Vale, pale and composed, her grief worn like a well-tailored coat. Julian Vale, the nephew, whose eyes darted too quickly. Miss Clara Finch, the secretary, quiet and observant. And Dr. Malcolm Reeves, a family friend whose calmness felt rehearsed. They all said the same thing. They had heard nothing. They had seen nothing. And yet blood stained the Persian rug in the study. Poirot knelt, examining the darkened patch. Blood, he said softly. Yes, but not enough. Not enough for what? Asked Inspector Bell, who had arrived reluctantly and with visible irritation. Not enough for death, Poirot replied. At least not here. Bell snorted. You always say that. Poirot smiled. And I am often correct. He walked slowly about the room, his eyes missing nothing. The desk was neat. Too neat. The fireplace had been cleaned recently. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped, its hands frozen at 9:40. Poirot felt a chill. Memory stirred again, elusive and maddening. I have been here before, he whispered. But when he searched his mind, the memory dissolved like mist. That night, alone in his hotel room, Poirot removed the letter from his pocket and read it again. Do not trust your memory. He understood now. Someone was playing a game, not merely with events, but with time itself. And the most dangerous opponent Poirot knew was one who understood him better than he understood himself. Outside, the clock in the corridor struck 10. Poirot looked up sharply. For just a moment, he had been certain it would stop at 9:40. ***, Part 2. A death without a body. Hercule Poirot slept badly. This, in itself, was unusual. He prided himself on a mind disciplined enough to rest when rest was required. Yet that night, his dreams were crowded with clocks, rows upon rows of them, each ticking at a slightly different rhythm, none agreeing on the hour. In every dream, without fail, the hand stopped at 9:40. He woke before dawn, his mustaches slightly disordered, and lay staring at the ceiling. A death without a body, he murmured, and a letter without a beginning. He rose, restored order to his appearance, and set his mind to work. Inspector Bell arrived at Ashcombe House shortly after breakfast, looking as though the entire affair offended him personally. No corpse, no weapon, no witnesses, he said gruffly. And now you tell me the victim may not even be dead where the blood was found. Poirot inclined his head politely. Not may not, Inspector. Was not. Bell sighed. You always say things like that. And you always listen, Poirot replied gently. Which does you great credit. They stood in the study once more. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the room's impeccable order. Too impeccable. Poirot gestured toward the rug. The blood tells us a story, Inspector, but it is a short one. A wound, yes. A struggle, perhaps, but not death. Bell folded his arms. Then where is Vale? Poirot's eyes flicked to the fireplace. Elsewhere. The household was summoned again. Mrs. Vale sat rigidly, her gloved hands clasped in her lap. Julian Vale leaned against the mantel, attempting nonchalance and failing. Miss Finch stood apart, her expression unreadable. Dr. Reeves watched them all with clinical detachment. Poirot addressed them calmly. Ladies and gentlemen, I will ask you a simple question. At precisely 9:40 p.m. on the night Mr. Edmund Vale disappeared, where were you? They answered one by one. Mrs. Vale had been in her room, writing letters. Julian Vale claimed to be walking the grounds. Miss Finch said she was organizing papers in the study. Until 9. Dr. Reeves had been reading in the library. Poirot nodded, as though satisfied. And did any of you hear the clock strike 9:30? There was a pause. Julian frowned. Now that you mention it, I don't think I did. Miss Finch looked sharply at him. Poirot smiled faintly. Interesting. Later, alone with Miss Finch, Poirot spoke quietly. You are observant, mademoiselle. She stiffened. I try to be. You noticed the clock had stopped. Yes, and yet you did not mention it. She hesitated. I assumed it was irrelevant. Poirot's eyes were kind but penetrating. In my experience, mademoiselle, nothing is irrelevant, especially when it pretends to be. She said nothing more. That afternoon, Poirot examined the grounds where Julian claimed to have walked. The path was damp from rain. Footprints were visible, only one set. They do not lie, Poirot murmured. But they do not tell the whole truth either. He bent, examining the earth near the study window. A faint smear rust-colored, diluted by rain. Blood. But again, not enough. Back in London that evening, Poirot removed a letter from his drawer once more. He read it slowly, savoring each word as though it might reveal a hidden meaning on the second reading. On the 17th of November, at precisely 9:40 p.m., a man will be murdered, though no body will ever be found. Poirot's brow furrowed. Murdered, he repeated. Not killed. There is a difference. A man could be murdered in reputation, in identity, in memory. The thought unsettled him. The next morning brought a new development. Inspector Bell burst into Poirot's flat, unusually flustered. "We found something," he said. "Not a body, but a passport." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Where?" "At Victoria Station. Left in a cloakroom locker. Edmund Vale's passport. And a ticket one way to Paris. Dated the night of the disappearance." Poirot sat down slowly. "So," he said, "our dead man travels." Bell frowned. "You don't think he staged it?" Poirot shook his head. "No. Vale was many things, Inspector, but he was not careless. And he was not sentimental enough to leave blood behind." Bell stared. "Then what are we dealing with?" Poirot looked toward the window, where London moved on, blissfully ignorant of its mysteries. "A man who no longer exists," he said softly, "and someone who wishes us to believe in a death that did not occur." That evening, Poirot received another letter. This one was typed. No signature, only a single line. "You are remembering too soon." Poirot closed his eyes. The game, it seemed, was accelerating. And somewhere, whether in the past, the future, or the fragile space between, someone was watching him very closely indeed. Asterisk. Part 3. The House of Silent Witnesses. Ashcombe House had many rooms, many windows, and many clocks. None of them agreed. Hercule Poirot noticed this the moment he crossed the threshold once more. The grandfather clock in the hall read 10 minutes past 11. The small gilt clock on the sideboard insisted it was nearly noon. In the drawing room, a delicate French timepiece had stopped entirely. "Disorder," Poirot murmured. "Not accidental." Inspector Bell followed him inside, notebook in hand, irritation etched permanently upon his face. "Clocks again," he said. "You really think they matter?" Poirot smiled faintly. "They matter very much, Inspector. Time is the only witness that cannot lie unless someone teaches it to." The household gathered yet again, their patience wearing thin. Mrs. Vale looked exhausted now, the careful composure cracking at the edges. Julian Vale's charm had curdled into defensiveness. Miss Finch watched silently, her eyes moving from face to face. Dr. Reeves remained calm, too calm. Poirot addressed them. "This house," he said, "is full of witnesses." Julian scoffed. "But none of us saw anything." Poirot inclined his head. "Just so. That is precisely what makes it interesting." He gestured toward the windows. "You see, when many people see nothing, it is usually because something has been arranged so that nothing can be seen." Poirot began with the servants. The cook had been in the kitchen all evening, the maid in the linen room, the butler polishing silver. Each testimony aligned perfectly, too perfectly. Poirot listened, nodding, asking gentle questions that seemed to wander but always returned to the same point. "What time did you hear the clock strike?" "Which clock?" "Ah, exactly." "In the study." Poirot examined the walls closely. No signs of struggle. Inspector Bell noted. Poirot ran a gloved finger along the bookshelf. "And yet the books have been rearranged." Bell frowned. "They look normal. Only if you do not know the owner. Edmund Vale arranged his books by height, not subject. This shelf," he tapped lightly, "has been disturbed. He pulled one book free. Behind it, the faint outline of a small safe. Empty. Miss Finch stood very still. Poirot turned to her. "You knew about the safe?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I typed the inventory. And when was it last opened?" She hesitated. "The afternoon before Mr. Vale disappeared." Poirot nodded. "And what was inside?" "Documents. Financial records. Some old correspondence." "Old," Poirot repeated. "How old?" She swallowed. "About 20 years." That evening, Poirot walked the corridors alone. Ashcombe House was very quiet. Too quiet. He paused outside the study. The air felt heavy, as though the room were holding its breath. Poirot closed his eyes. Memory pressed in again, stronger this time. A different house. A different case. A man who had vanished, leaving behind blood and confusion. "I remember," Poirot whispered, but the memory fractured before it could take shape. He opened his eyes sharply. "Someone is stealing my past," he said aloud. The next morning brought revelation, not from a person, but from the house itself. Poirot noticed the windows. From the outside, one could see into the study clearly, except between 9:30 and 9:50 p.m., when the angle of the sun and the heavy curtains created a perfect blind spot. No one could have seen inside. Poirot said to Inspector Bell, "Not from the grounds. Not from the road." Bell stared. "You're saying the house helped hide the crime?" Poirot smiled. "The house was designed to." He gathered everyone in the drawing room. "This house," Poirot announced, "has been a silent witness. And like many witnesses, it has been instructed what to say." Julian laughed harshly. "You're talking nonsense." Poirot turned to him. "On the contrary. You walked the grounds at 9:40, did you not?" "Yes, and yet no one saw you." Julian stiffened. "Because," Poirot continued gently, "you were not walking. You were waiting. For what?" Julian snapped. For the moment when no one could see inside the study. Silence fell. Poirot turned next to Mrs. Vale. "You were writing letters." But the ink had not yet dried when I examined them the next morning. She gasped softly. Poirot nodded. "And you, Dr. Reeves, you were reading. But the book you claimed to read had not been opened in weeks." Reeves' calm finally faltered. "And Miss Finch," Poirot said softly, "you were organizing papers, including documents that someone wished to remove." Miss Finch closed her eyes. "We all told the truth," she said. "Just not the whole of it." Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely." Inspector Bell exhaled sharply. "So who killed Vale?" Poirot shook his head. "No one." "Not yet." Bell stared. "Not yet?" Poirot looked at the stopped clock in the corner. "A man can be murdered in stages, Inspector. First his past, then his identity, finally his life." He turned away. "The house has spoken," he said quietly. "And it tells us this was only the beginning." That night, Poirot returned to London. Waiting on his desk was another letter. This one, once again, in his own handwriting. "You are closer now, but you still trust the wrong witnesses. The next crime will leave a body, and you will wish it had not." Poirot folded the letter carefully. "For the first time," he murmured, "I do not doubt you." Outside, the city's clocks struck the hour, and for once, they all agreed. Part 4. The woman who lied perfectly. Hercule Poirot believed that lies, like fingerprints, always contained imperfections, a hesitation, an excess of detail, a tremor in the voice, or an eagerness to convince. A perfect lie, Poirot had long maintained, was a myth, until he met Eleanor March. She lived in a narrow townhouse near Bloomsbury. Respectable and unremarkable, the sort of place one passed daily without ever noticing. Poirot noticed it immediately. The windows were too clean, the doorbell too polished, the nameplate freshly replaced. "This," Poirot murmured to himself, "is the home of a woman who prepares." Captain Hastings, standing beside him, looked puzzled. "Prepares for what, Poirot?" Poirot did not answer. He rang the bell. Eleanor March was in her early 30s, dressed simply, her hair neatly pinned back. She possessed a calm, open face, pleasant rather than beautiful, and eyes of a clear, steady gray, eyes that did not flinch. "Mr. Poirot," she said, as though greeting an old acquaintance. "I wondered when you would come." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle March, you expected me?" "Yes." No hesitation. No surprise. Poirot's little gray cells stirred uneasily. They sat in her modest sitting room. Tea was served promptly, poured without spilling a drop. Poirot observed everything: the placement of the cups, the absence of personal photographs, the faint scent of lavender measured, not excessive. "You worked for Edmund Vale." Poirot said "yes, 10 years ago. You left suddenly." "Yes." "Why?" She met his gaze calmly. "Because I chose to." Poirot waited. She did not elaborate. Most people did. "You were mentioned in documents removed from Mr. Vale's safe." Poirot continued "yes. You are not curious how I know this?" "No." Poirot smiled thinly. "You see, Hastings," he said lightly, "most people ask questions when they are afraid." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "And you are not afraid, mademoiselle?" "No." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "That," he said softly, "is your first lie." She did not react. Poirot changed tack. "Tell me about the night of the 17th of November." She folded her hands neatly. "I was at home, alone. I read until 10, then went to bed." "No visitors?" "No." "No letters?" "No." "No phone calls?" "No." Her answers came smoothly, evenly, without the slightest tremor. Poirot felt a chill. She was not rehearsed. She was convinced. After they left, Hastings exhaled loudly. "Well," he said, "she seemed perfectly straightforward to me." Poirot stopped walking. "That," he said quietly, "is what terrifies me." Poirot spent the next 2 days investigating Eleanor March. He found nothing. No suspicious finances, no hidden relationships, no inconsistencies in her past. She had worked for Vale, yes, but left without scandal. She had since lived quietly, respectably. Too invisibly. She has erased herself. Poirot murmured. The break came unexpectedly. "Inspector, Bell arrived with news of a second crime. A body. Not Edmund Vale's. A young man. Found dead in a rented flat near King's Cross. Stabbed once, cleanly. No signs of struggle. Time of death? 9:40 p.m. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Name?" he asked. "Thomas Reed," Bell replied. "Clerk. No criminal record." "But," he hesitated, "he once worked briefly for Vale." Poirot nodded. The pattern sharpens. Poirot visited the flat. Sparse furnishings. Recently occupied. On the table lay a single object. A photograph. It showed Edmund Vale. And Eleanor March. Much younger. Standing close. Intimate. Poirot's eyes hardened. "So," he murmured, "you did not erase everything." He returned to Eleanor March that evening. This time, she looked tired. Only slightly. "You've come again." She sighed. "Yes." "You have found something." "Yes." She waited. Poirot placed the photograph on the table. Her gaze dropped to it. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not guilt. Recognition. "You loved him." Poirot said quietly. "Yes." "And he ruined you." "Yes." Her voice did not waver. Poirot studied her. "You did not kill Thomas Reed," he said. "No." "I believe you." She looked at him sharply. "Why?" "Because your lies are too perfect," Poirot said. "Murder introduces chaos. You despise chaos." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she spoke. "You are very clever." "Mr. Poirot." Poirot inclined his head. "And you," he replied, "are very dangerous." She stood and walked to the window. "Vale destroyed lives," she said calmly. "Careers, families, futures, and he never paid." Poirot said nothing. "I am not the murderer," she continued. "But I know who is." Poirot's heart quickened. "Who?" She turned back to him. "You." The word hung in the air like smoke. Poirot did not move. "You don't remember yet," she said gently. "But you will." That night, Poirot sat alone in his flat, staring at the letter written in his own hand. Memory surged violently. A case, long buried. A compromise. A decision made to preserve order rather than justice. Poirot's hands trembled. For the first time in many years, what have I done? He whispered. The clock struck 10. Then stopped. At 9:40. Part 5. The Missing Hour. Hercule Poirot did not believe in panic. Panic was a failure of order, and order was the foundation upon which his mind rested. Yet as he stared at the clock, frozen at 9:40, he felt something dangerously close to it, an awareness that a part of his life had been carefully, deliberately removed, not forgotten. Taken. He reached for his notebook, the one he had kept for years, its pages filled with neat handwriting, dates, observations, his own private archive of truth. He turned to the section marked November 20 years ago. There was a gap. One entire page had been torn out. Poirot closed the notebook slowly. So, he murmured, even I have been edited. The next morning, Poirot visited Dr. Malcolm Reeves. If memory itself was under attack, then the mind must be questioned. Reeves welcomed him with professional warmth, though his eyes betrayed unease. You look tired. Poirot. I am missing an hour, Poirot replied. Reeves blinked. We all misremember things. Poirot smiled thinly. Not like this. Reeves conducted a series of tests, simple questions, associations, timelines. Poirot answered them all flawlessly. Too flawlessly. You see? Reeves said. Your mind is as sharp as ever. Poirot leaned forward. Then, explain why I remember the beginning of a case and its end, but not its most important moment. Reeves hesitated. That can happen, he said slowly, in cases of moral conflict. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Moral conflict, he repeated. You mean guilt? Reeves did not answer. That afternoon, Poirot returned to Ashcombe House alone. The house was silent now, emptied of its occupants. Like a skull stripped of thought, he stood in the study. Show me, he whispered. He examined the clock closely. It had not stopped. It had been stopped. A thin scratch marked CA sign G made by a fingernail. Poirot felt a sudden clarity. The missing hour, he murmured, was not lost. It was hidden. He reconstructed the night. At 9:30. The house was visible from every angle. At 9:40. The blind spot formed. At 9:50. Visibility returned. 10 minutes of darkness. But an hour missing from memory. Why? Because something had happened before the crime. Something Poirot had chosen not to remember. Inspector Bell arrived as Poirot was leaving. We've identified the victim, Bell said. Thomas Reed wasn't just a clerk. He was investigating Vale, quietly, on behalf of someone else. Poirot nodded. Eleanor March. Bell stared. How did you know? Poirot did not answer. That evening, Poirot confronted Eleanor March once more. This time, she did not offer tea. You found the hour, she said calmly. Not yet, Poirot replied. But I know why it is missing. She studied him. You made a decision, she said. Long ago, when you believed was just. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Yes, you let a man go. Yes, her voice hardened. And he destroyed lives afterward. Poirot's voice was barely audible. Yes. She leaned closer. You solved the case, she said. But you chose order over justice. And then you erased the moment from your mind. Poirot straightened. I did not erase it, he said firmly. I sealed it. There is a difference. She laughed softly. Is there? That night, Poirot dreamed. He saw himself younger, standing in a dimly lit room. Vale sat opposite him, smiling faintly. You won't ruin me, Vale said. Poirot replied. No, but you will stop. Vale laughed and walked free. Poirot woke with a gasp. The missing hour had returned. The next morning brought a final blow. Inspector Bell arrived. Grim-faced. Vale has been seen, he said. Alive, in Paris. Poirot closed his eyes. So, he said, the dead man lives. Bell swallowed. And he knows you're coming. Poirot picked up his hat. Then, he said quietly, it is time I finished what I began. Part 6. Hastings begins to doubt Captain Arthur Hastings had known Hercule Poirot for many years. He had seen him brilliant, amused, irritated, triumphant. He had even seen him afraid once or twice. In fleeting moments, Poirot believed unnoticed, but he had never seen him like this. Poirot had grown quieter. Not withdrawn, Poirot never withdrew, but inwardly tense, as though every word he spoke had first been weighed against something unspoken. His immaculate routines had begun to fracture in small, disturbing ways. Once, Hastings noticed Poirot placed his hat on the table instead of its usual hook. Another time, he drank his coffee before it was fully sweetened. Tiny things. But Hastings had learned long ago that with Poirot, tiny things mattered. They sat together in Poirot's flat, the afternoon light slanting across the familiar furniture. Hastings watched Poirot read the newspaper, then read it again, folding it with almost aggressive precision. "Poirot," Hastings said finally, "you're not telling me something." Poirot did not look up. "Am I not, mon ami?" "No," Hastings replied firmly. "And whatever it is, it's serious." Poirot sighed and set the paper aside. "You have always been observant, Hastings," he said gently. "More than you believe. Then don't insult me by pretending everything is normal." Poirot met his gaze. "That," he said softly, "is precisely what I am trying to determine." Hastings leaned forward. "This business with Vale," he said. "The letters, the clocks, Paris. You're involved in this more deeply than you admit." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes." Hastings' jaw tightened. "How deeply?" Poirot hesitated. That hesitation brief, almost imperceptible, was enough. Hastings felt a chill. "You don't trust me anymore," he said quietly. Poirot winced. "It is not a question of trust," he replied. "It is a question of protection." "Protection from what?" Poirot did not answer. The doubt took root that evening. Hastings returned to his rooms unsettled, his mind replaying Eleanor March's words Poirot had not repeated, but which Hastings somehow felt hovering in the air between them. The next morning, Hastings paid a visit of his own, not to Poirot. To Inspector Bell. Bell raised an eyebrow as Hastings explained his concerns. "You think Poirot's hiding something?" "I know he is," Hastings replied. "The question is what?" Bell leaned back. "You wouldn't be the first to wonder. There are gaps in the records. Old cases. Ones that ended neatly, but perhaps too neatly." Hastings' heart sank. "Like Vale?" Bell nodded. "No charges ever stuck." Poirot testified. The man walked. Hastings swallowed. "That doesn't mean Poirot was wrong." Bell studied him. "No, but it does mean he's human." That afternoon, Hastings confronted Poirot again. This time, he was less gentle. "Did you let Vale go?" Hastings demanded. Poirot stiffened. "Yes," he said quietly. "Knowing what he was?" "Yes." Hastings stood abruptly. "You always told me justice mattered more than convenience." Poirot rose as well. "And it does," he said fiercely. "But justice without proof is tyranny." "And what about the lives ruined afterward?" Hastings shot back. Poirot's voice dropped. "That," he said, "is the question that has followed me every day since." Silence fell between them. For the first time in their long friendship, Hastings felt unsure which side of the room Poirot truly stood on. "You erased it," Hastings said slowly. "Didn't you?" "That hour." Poirot did not deny it. "I contained it," he replied, "so that I could continue to serve justice without bias." Hastings stared at him. "Or without guilt?" Poirot flinched. That night, Hastings could not sleep. He dreamed of Poirot standing in a courtroom, testifying calmly, while a shadow loomed behind him. Vale's shadow. Smiling. When Hastings awoke, one thought would not leave him. What if Poirot is wrong again? The next day brought news from Paris. Vale had vanished. Again. But this time, he had left something behind. A note. Written in careful, familiar handwriting. "You are too late, Poirot. The final hour approaches." Hastings read the note twice. Then a third time. "This handwriting," he said slowly. "It looks like..." Poirot closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Mine." Hastings felt something break. "You wrote to him," he said. At some point. You were in contact. Poirot nodded. Years ago. To warn him? To warn him? Hastings echoed incredulously. Or to protect him. Poirot's voice was very quiet. To control him. Hastings stepped back as though struck. You always said no one was above the law. And no one is, Poirot replied. Not even me. Hastings shook his head. I don't know you anymore, he said. Poirot's expression tightened. That, he said softly, may be necessary? That evening, Hastings made a decision he never imagined he would make. He followed Poirot, discreetly, carefully, with the same methods. Poirot himself had taught him years ago. Poirot noticed thought of course he did, but he did not turn around. Poirot stopped outside a small, anonymous building near the Thames. He entered alone. Hastings waited. Heart-pounding minutes passed, then voices raised. Tense. Hastings moved closer, through the cracked door. He heard Poirot speak words that froze his blood. If you kill again, Poirot said, it will be because I failed you once before. Another voice replied low, amused, or because you taught me how. Hastings stepped back. Shaken. The doubt was no longer theoretical. It was real. And it was dangerous. When Poirot emerged, he found Hastings waiting. They stared at each other. No pretense remained. You followed me, Poirot said. Yes. You doubt me? Yes. Poirot nodded slowly. Then, he said, you are exactly where you must be. Hastings frowned. What do you mean? Poirot's eyes were grave. Because the next crime, he said, will force you to choose between me and the truth. Part 7. The second crime. Hercule Poirot stood in the fog-drenched streets of London, his coat collar raised against the early winter chill. He had returned from Paris, weary yet alert, haunted by the knowledge that Edmund Vale was still alive, and that the letters written in his own hand had set in motion a deadly game beyond his control. Even Hastings' presence beside him offered little comfort. The captain's doubts still lingered like a shadow over every decision Poirot made. This night, however, was different. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, a tension that crawled along the cobblestones, seeping into every street lamp and echoing from the damp walls of the alleyways. Poirot, ever attentive to the subtleties of his environment, felt the familiar stir of anticipation. There is something, Poirot murmured, voice low, almost to himself, that is being orchestrated with great precision. The hand is cunning, the mind dangerous, but familiar. Hastings, shivering under his overcoat, asked, You mean Vale? Poirot's small green eyes narrowed. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone who learned from him. Someone who studied my methods too well. The following morning brought terrible news. Another body had been discovered, this time in an elegant townhouse near Bloomsbury. The victim was Professor Adrian Lyle, an academic specializing in European antiquities. He had been stabbed in his study, seated at his desk, a single wound cleanly delivered to the heart. The time of death, determined by forensic experts, was exactly 9:40 p.m. Poirot examined the scene with meticulous care. The study was arranged with familiar precision, books sorted by size rather than subject, papers stacked at right angles, a cup of tea on a saucer that had not spilled a drop despite the apparent struggle. He knelt beside the body, eyes scanning the wound. Ah, he said softly, the signature is unmistakable. Inspector Bell frowned. Signature? This is murder, Poirot, not art critique. On the contrary, Poirot replied, rising to his full height. Murder often carries the signature of its author. In this case, someone is copying a pattern of murder from my past. Bell stiffened. From your past? Poirot nodded. Yes, many years ago, a man named Lucien Harcourt, another financier, was killed in nearly identical circumstances. The room, the time, the method, the staging, and yet the body was never found in my original case. Someone has studied it and chosen to reproduce it. Exactly. Hastings' eyes widened. So Vale, or whoever this is, they're deliberately trying to taunt you. Poirot inclined his head. Or to teach me a lesson. Poirot began to reconstruct the sequence of events. 9:30 p.m. All normal. 9:40 p.m. Murder, methodical, precise. No witnesses. 9:50 p.m. Scene staged to appear as though the victim had simply vanished. Leaving an atmosphere of confusion, Poirot ran his gloved fingers along the desk. The murderer understands my mind. He knows my habits, my expectations. He even knows the importance I place on symmetry and timing. Hastings shuddered. But why repeat a murder from your past? Why bring up old cases? Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. Because the killer wants to remind me that my past mistakes are never forgotten. That every life spared, every error overlooked has consequences. Poirot next examined the victim's correspondence. Professor Lyle had been working on a book detailing European antiquities lost during the First World War. Poirot noted one letter in particular, a brief, carefully typed note. The truth is never buried, only postponed. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He turned to Hastings. This is not a random act. It is precise, deliberate, and designed to provoke fear. Hastings asked, Fear? Or guilt? Poirot shook his head. Both, my friend, both. Poirot visited Eleanor March that afternoon. The woman who had once terrified him with the perfection of her lies now offered guidance, her insight sharper than ever. You understand the pattern? She asked, a faint smile on her lips. Yes, Poirot replied, but understanding is not enough. The killer is daring me to make a mistake. She leaned closer. And he knows you will, if only because he understands your mind as well as, or perhaps better than you understand yourself. Poirot nodded grimly. Indeed, and that is why Hastings' doubt is dangerous. If my closest friend cannot trust me, the killer gains an advantage. Night fell. Poirot walked the Thames embankment, contemplating the next move. Suddenly, a shadow moved near the water's edge. A man emerged, a courier with an envelope in hand. Poirot accepted it without a word. Inside was a photograph. One he recognized immediately. The arrangement mirrored the murder of Lucien Harcourt. The study, the angle of the lamp, the placement of the body. The time frozen at 9:40 p.m. Poirot examined it slowly. Every detail had been replicated. Every nuance copied. This, he whispered, is no longer merely a murder. It is a message. A challenge. A warning. Poirot convened a meeting with Inspector Bell, Hastings, and Eleanor March that evening. The mood was tense, heavy with anticipation. Poirot paced slowly, examining each face. The killer, he began, is meticulous, patient, and dangerous. He has studied my cases, my methods, my habits. He knows my weaknesses and my principles. And now he is daring me to respond. Bell asked, and the pattern? What does it tell us? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It tells us that the next crime will be more personal. Not merely a repetition, but a calculated evolution. The killer is learning. He will not stop until he forces me to confront what I thought long buried. Hastings swallowed nervously. You mean, this is about more than Vale? Poirot nodded. Much more. This is about the consequences of every decision I have ever made. Every man I spared. Every error I tolerated. Every hour I forgot. The killer is forcing me to account for all of them. That night, Poirot lay awake, tracing the timeline of the original Lucien Harcourt case in his mind. Every subtle shift, every misdirection, every clue overlooked. He realized with a shudder that the second crime was not random, it was deliberate pedagogy, teaching him a lesson he had once thought he had learned. Hastings watched him, anxiety etched deep across his face. Poirot, he whispered, are you sure we can stop him? Poirot smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. We must, Hastings, he said, because if we fail, the consequences will not merely touch our friends or our victims, but me. He reached for the letter on his desk, written in his own hand and yet bearing the voice of the unseen enemy. The game has begun again. Prepare, Monsieur Poirot, for your most personal challenge. Poirot pressed the paper to his chest. Ah, he murmured. The little gray cells must work harder than ever. Hastings shivered. I just hope they are enough. Poirot did not answer immediately. He gazed out the window at the dark river, reflecting the dim lamplight. "Mon ami," he said finally, "if the past is returning, we must confront it. And we shall. Because the truth is never as hidden as one believes." Part 8. The hidden motive. The storm had settled over London, leaving behind streets slick with rain and a mist that clung to the Thames like a shroud. Hercule Poirot sat in his flat, reviewing every detail of the crimes, the letters, and the photographs that had arrived like taunting invitations from an unseen adversary. Hastings paced nervously, while Eleanor March remained unusually silent, her eyes tracing the patterns Poirot had laid out across the table. "This is no ordinary crime," Poirot said, speaking slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of each word could bring clarity. "We are not dealing merely with revenge. Not merely with a man alive after being presumed dead. No, this is something far deeper. Something buried long ago." Hastings frowned. "Deeper than Vale's grudge?" Poirot shook his head. "Way deeper, mon ami. The roots stretch into the past, before any of the current victims, before anyone we have suspected. Someone has been planning, waiting, hiding a motive that not even Vale himself could fully comprehend." Poirot's thoughts returned to the first victim, Edmund Vale, a man brilliant in finance, ruthless in ambition, and capable of charming or destroying anyone in his path. Poirot recalled the letters left by Vale, the warnings in his own handwriting, and the subtle messages hidden in photographs and documents. It was as if every small act in Vale's life had been catalogued, weighed, and stored, awaiting this precise moment. He reviewed the second murder. Professor Adrian Lyle. Lyle had been innocuous, diligent, and quiet. Yet his murder mirrored a long-forgotten case from Poirot's past. The connection seemed random to everyone else, but Poirot knew it was deliberate. "There is a thread," he murmured, "a golden thread connecting these events. And it leads to a secret that has been carefully buried for 20 years. Poirot summoned Hastings and Eleanor to Ashcombe House once more. This time, the house felt different. The air was heavier, the silence thicker, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Poirot walked slowly through the study, examining the spaces where previous evidence had been found. "You see, Hastings," Poirot said, "all these murders are guided by a single motive. And this motive is hidden in plain sight. We must uncover it before the killer strikes again." He turned to Eleanor. "You understand the subtlety of lies, mademoiselle. Tell me, what do you see?" Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly. A man who believes his past can be controlled. A man who thought he could manipulate events without consequence. And now, someone reminds him that the past always demands repayment. Poirot nodded slowly. "Precisely. And the repayment will be painful." They began reconstructing the chain of events. 20 years ago, Vale had been involved in a scandal, one that ruined an innocent man and allowed Vale to rise in power. Professor Lyle, as it turned out, had been indirectly affected by the same events, his career and reputation subtly undermined by Vale's manipulation. Eleanor March had also suffered. She had loved Vale and been betrayed, her career destroyed, and her personal life ruined. Poirot paused. "Do you see? The motive is not simple revenge. It is a meticulous accounting of past wrongs. Each murder, each act, is calculated to reflect the exact damage Vale caused." Hastings' face paled. "You mean someone has waited 20 years to balance the scales?" "Yes," Poirot said firmly. "And the killer is using my own cases, my own methods, to ensure that the lesson is taught." "Perfectly." Poirot now turned his attention to the letters, the ones written in his own hand. At first they had seemed like a cruel trick, but he now realized they were more than that. "They are breadcrumbs," he said, "placed to lead me to the truth, but also to challenge me, to see if my judgment, my conscience, can endure the weight of decades of hidden crimes." Eleanor leaned closer. "And what about Vale? He's still alive. Does the killer intend to kill him?" Poirot's expression was grim. "Of course. Vale must answer for the damage he caused. But not before we uncover the full motive. We must understand it completely, for only then can we anticipate the final move. They retraced Vale's steps from Paris. The trail was subtle. A bank transfer here, a forgotten contract there, letters that had never been sent. Poirot realized that the killer had intimate knowledge of every detail. This person, he said, has watched us all for years. Learned our habits, our weaknesses, our patterns. The motive, Hastings, is not just revenge. It is justice 20 years in the making, crafted with precision to punish Vale for every life he ruined. Hastings shivered. It's terrifying. Yes, Poirot agreed. And it gets worse. The killer is not done yet. Each act, each murder, is carefully staged to provoke me, to force me to confront the consequences of past decisions. My own conscience is part of the plan. Poirot returned to Ashcombe House that evening, alone. He examined the study, tracing the lines of sight, the placement of desks and chairs, and the positions of the victims. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The killer, Poirot murmured, has chosen not only the victims but also the method of murder based on my previous investigations. Every scene, every clock, every moment, designed to echo a past case where my judgment was tested. He paused. And now, Hastings, the final act approaches. The killer will strike where I least expect, using every shadow, every misremembered hour, and every past failure. The hidden motive is clear, to make me accountable. Personally, morally, and intellectually. Eleanor March entered silently. And you are ready? Poirot looked at her, his eyes hard. No, mademoiselle. One can never be completely ready for such a challenge. But I will face it. I must. Because the consequences are no longer abstract. They are immediate, precise, and deadly. And the final hour will decide not only Vale's fate, but the fate of everyone caught in this web. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the lights of the city. Inside Ashcombe House, Poirot's little gray cells worked tirelessly, reconstructing decades of deceit, betrayal, and carefully hidden motives. The hidden motive was no longer a mystery. It was a challenge. And the killer, lurking unseen, was ready to deliver the final lesson. Poirot pressed the photograph of the second murder to his chest. 20 years of hidden wrongs. 20 years of silent witnesses. And now, the reckoning. Hastings shivered, realizing at last that the danger was not just to Vale or the victims, but to Poirot himself. Every subtle misjudgment, every overlooked detail, every lapse in memory could be fatal. The storm outside returned, winds lashing against the windows. Poirot stood at the center of the room, a solitary figure surrounded by shadows, determined to confront the past and unmask the killer whose patience, skill, and cruelty had spanned decades. Part 9. The trap is set. The evening was cold and damp, with a London fog that wrapped the streets in a ghostly embrace. Hercule Poirot had spent the entire day preparing, his meticulous mind orchestrating a plan so precise that even a single deviation could ruin everything. The house chosen for the trap was Ashcombe House, once again, but now stripped of servants and unessential clutter. Every room, every chair, every lamp was arranged with deliberate care. Captain Hastings watched from the side, a mixture of anxiety and awe in his expression. Even after years of following Poirot, he could never fully anticipate the methods of the Belgian detective. Poirot, Hastings said quietly, are you sure this will work? Poirot's green eyes gleamed. Mon ami, everything is in place. The stage is set. All that remains is for the actor, the killer, to reveal himself. The suspects had been summoned under the pretense of a social gathering. Mrs. Vale, pale but dignified, arrived first, carrying an air of quiet tension. Julian Vale, now openly defensive, lingered at the edge of the hall, pretending casual disinterest. Miss Clara Finch, calm and observant, entered next. Her face unreadable. Dr. Malcolm Reeves, polite yet measured, appeared last, his eyes following every movement, every shadow. Poirot greeted each with the exact blend of courtesy and subtle interrogation that had become his trademark. You are all here because the truth demands it, he said. Voice calm, measured, yet carrying a weight that silenced the room. This evening, we will uncover what has remained hidden for 20 years. Asterisk. He led them to the drawing room. Every seat, every object had been deliberately placed. A large table stood in the center, with photographs, letters, and documents laid out in neat rows. A small clock, deliberately set at 9:40, dominated the mantelpiece. Poirot began by addressing the room. 20 years ago, a man named Edmund Vale committed acts that destroyed lives. And yet, he remained free. The wronged had no voice, and justice was not served. Mrs. Vale shifted slightly. Julian Vale's jaw tightened. Miss Finch remained impassive, and Dr. Reeves' calm persisted. Since that time, Poirot continued, someone has been orchestrating a sequence of events. The first victim vanished. The second was murdered. Each act, each timing, each subtle detail was chosen to reflect the wrongs of the past and to challenge the very mind of the one who investigates them. Hastings swallowed audibly. You mean the killer has been anticipating your moves? Poirot nodded. Precisely. Someone has studied my past cases, my methods, my habits. They have watched, waited, and learned. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. And now, he said softly, the final act will occur here tonight. The trap is set. Poirot then revealed the centerpiece of his plan, a subtle arrangement of signals, mirrors, and hidden observation points that allowed him to watch every movement without being seen. He had instructed Hastings to monitor entrances while he remained hidden, relying on his little gray cells to anticipate the killer's actions. Eleanor March arrived unexpectedly. Her presence added a tension that none of the others could ignore. She approached Poirot quietly. You've predicted everything, she said. But are you ready for what happens if you're wrong? Poirot inclined his head. Prepared, mademoiselle. But readiness is never certainty. And certainty never exists where cunning is involved. Hours passed. Conversation remained polite but taut, the tension rising like the swell of a storm. Poirot observed each suspect, their expressions, their gestures, the micro-expressions that betrayed unspoken thought. Then, at precisely 9:40 p.m., he noticed it, a subtle movement near the window, a shadow elongated. Careful, deliberate approach to study. Poirot's pulse quickened, not from fear, but anticipation. The figure entered the room. It was Julian Vale. He moved with precision, lifting documents from the table as though he had rehearsed the motion countless times. His eyes flicked to the clock. Poirot remained silent, hidden in an alcove perfectly concealed. Hastings, stationed near the doorway, Tensed. Julian paused, a faint smile on his lips. He believed himself unseen, in control. Poirot emerged slowly, his presence commanding yet composed. Monsieur Vale, Poirot said softly, deliberately. Do you truly believe you have evaded my observation? Julian spun, startled but quickly masking it. Poirot, he exclaimed, feigning indignation. What is the meaning of this? Poirot's eyes flickered with calm intensity. The meaning, mon ami, is that the game is over. Poirot revealed the evidence, the documents, the staged photographs, and the letters that had arrived over the past weeks, all pointing to a deliberate plan to manipulate, murder, and intimidate. Julian Vale's composure cracked. It's not what you think, he stammered. Ah, Poirot said, pacing slowly. But it is exactly what I think. You have orchestrated each event, timed each act, manipulated the innocent and guilty alike, believing that no one could trace the path from past to present. Eleanor March stepped forward. And yet, Poirot sees the truth. Yes, Poirot replied, because the truth leaves traces, even when one attempts to hide it with precision. The little gray cells see what the eyes cannot. Julian Vale's arrogance began to falter. He realized that Poirot had anticipated every move. Every stolen letter, every forged message, every calculated delay, all traced back to him. Poirot pressed the point further. Tell me, Monsieur Vale, why the second murder? Why replicate the crime from my past? Was it to frighten me? To prove your brilliance? Julian's face contorted. It was. To punish you. He spat. You think your little gray cells make you untouchable. But you let men like me rise. You let the innocent suffer while you walked free with your cleverness." Poirot's gaze was steady, almost sympathetic. "I did not create injustice, mon ami. I observed it as I must. But now, the past is returned, and the consequences are upon you." The final act was swift. Poirot's plan left Julian with no escape. The hidden police, positioned according to Poirot's instructions, moved in silently, cutting off any attempt at flight. Julian Vale, now cornered, attempted a last-ditch bluff, but Poirot anticipated each movement. "You see," Poirot said softly, "a mind obsessed with revenge will always make one error. And tonight that error has revealed itself." Inspector Bell stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Julian Vale, realizing the inevitability, slumped in defeat. Poirot turned to Hastings. "Observe, mon ami, the importance of preparation, patience, and careful attention to detail. Even the most cunning adversary leaves a trace." Hastings exhaled, relief mingled with awe. "I've never seen you like this, Poirot." Poirot smiled faintly, though a shadow lingered in his eyes. "The trap is not merely for the guilty. It is also for the errors of the past, mon ami. And sometimes, the greatest trap is the one we've set for ourselves." As the night deepened, Poirot reviewed the events. The killer had been caught, but the web of deceit, revenge, and consequence had spanned decades. Each murder, each letter, each stage scene had been designed to test him, not just his intellect, but his conscience. He looked at Eleanor March. "The final stage approaches," he said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "And now, the truth will be revealed." Poirot pressed his gloved hands together. The little gray cells had worked tirelessly, and yet he knew the final revelation would be both a triumph and a reckoning. The trap had been set. And now, the stage was ready for the final act, the unveiling of the mind behind all the crimes. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 10, The Little Gray Cells. Prevail the storm had returned in full fury by the morning of the final confrontation. London streets were rivers of gray, rain lashing against windows and splashing across cobblestones. Ashcombe House, standing solemnly on the hill, seemed almost to hold its breath, as though aware that the final act of this long and intricate drama was about to unfold. Inside, Hercule Poirot moved with calm deliberation. Every object was in its proper place, every document carefully examined, every chair positioned to create an unobstructed view of the room. The house had been transformed into a theater, the stage for the most delicate and complex performance of his career. Even the shadows had been accounted for, their angles measured and predicted. Captain Hastings observed him with a mix of apprehension and awe. "Poirot," he said softly, "tonight we see the end. But I can't help thinking, what if we've underestimated him? What if he's prepared for even this?" Poirot smiled faintly, though there was steel beneath it. "Hastings, mon ami, the little gray cells must always be trusted, not for their speed, nor for their brilliance alone, but for their ability to discern truth amidst the chaos. And tonight they shall prevail." The suspects had been summoned again under careful pretense. This time, each one arrived aware, perhaps vaguely, that the net was closing. Mrs. Vale appeared calm, though her hands trembled ever so slightly. Julian Vale walked in with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, but his eyes betrayed suspicion and fear. Miss Clara Finch, ever observant, greeted Poirot with a slight nod. Hiding any trace of emotion behind her composed mask, Dr. Malcolm Reeves maintained his clinical poise, though Poirot could sense his careful calculation of every movement and word. Eleanor March arrived last, silent and alert, aware of the roles each person would play in the unveiling of truth. Poirot greeted each with his precise mixture of warmth and subtle interrogation. "You are all here," he said, "because the time has come for the truth to emerge. What has been hidden, concealed, or forgotten shall now be revealed." The drawing room was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls as the storm rattled the windows. In the center of the room lay a carefully arranged tableau. Photographs, letters, and objects from each crime, laid out with precision. A clock on the mantelpiece, deliberately frozen at 9:40, served as both symbol and witness. Poirot began his exposition. 20 years ago, Edmund Vale committed acts that destroyed lives. His ambition, unchecked, left a trail of ruined careers, broken families, and betrayed loyalties. And yet he walked free, shielded by circumstance and fortune. Some wrongs, however, cannot remain buried forever. He paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle over the room. Every eye was fixed upon him, every breath suspended. The first act of this long game was the disappearance of Vale himself, accompanied by letters written in my own hand. Letters designed to mislead, manipulate, and force the pursuit of justice. The second act was the murder of Professor Adrian Lyle, whose death mirrored a case from my past. Every detail, every timing, every nuance was a message, a challenge, and a lesson. Hastings whispered, barely audible, "So it was always about teaching you?" Poirot nodded. "Not teaching, mon ami, testing. Every action has consequences." And now, the final lesson approaches. The one who orchestrated this, who manipulated, murdered, and staged, is among us. The room remained silent. Julian Vale's eyes narrowed, his lips tightening. Poirot's gaze swept the room, observing micro-expressions, fleeting reactions, and subtle twitches that would go unnoticed by anyone else. Poirot's voice lowered, precise and deliberate. "The killer is cunning, patient, and brilliant, but he cannot hide from the little gray cells. The truth leaves traces, even when masked by time, deception, and fear." He began to reveal the intricate pattern. Edmund Vale, the architect of the original wrongs, alive but vulnerable. Professor Adrian Lyle murdered in the style of a past case to remind Poirot of mistakes and oversights. Thomas Reed, a pawn, whose death was intended to manipulate the investigation and test human reactions. The letters and photographs, deliberate breadcrumbs, designed to provoke, intimidate, and mislead. The timing, every act occurred at 9:40 p.m., linking each event to the hour of unresolved past injustice. Poirot's voice rose slightly. All of this, carefully orchestrated, points to a single mind. A mind that studied mine, anticipated my reasoning, and attempted to force me to confront both my intellect and my conscience. Poirot moved suddenly, producing the critical piece of evidence, a collection of letters written in his own hand years ago, carefully retrieved from a hidden compartment in the mantelpiece. These letters, he explained, were meant to guide, not mislead. Yet someone seized them, used them to manipulate events, and forced a chain of murders designed to challenge me personally. Who among us, Poirot paused, eyes narrowing, had both the motive and the means to enact this elaborate scheme? The room held its collective breath. Poirot's gaze landed on Eleanor March. Her face betrayed nothing. "Ah," he said softly, "you see the brilliance of this person. They hid in plain sight, leaving subtle traces, testing our reasoning, manipulating our perceptions, and yet failing to anticipate one thing: the power of observation, deduction, and conscience." Julian Vale made a sudden, desperate move, stepping toward the door. "Poirot," he began. Poirot's hand moved with practiced precision, pointing to him. "Non, mon ami. It is you who is revealed." The room erupted in astonishment. Julian's arrogance faltered, then cracked. Poirot continued relentlessly. "You timed every act, manipulated evidence, and exploited the weaknesses of others. You sought revenge, not merely for past wrongs, but to test the very detective who had foiled your predecessors. And yet, every move betrayed you. Your ego, your haste, your overconfidence, they left a trace that even the most cunning mind cannot erase." Julian Vale's face contorted in fury and disbelief. You can't prove," Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but I have proof. Your fingerprints on the letters, your handwriting on the notes left at each scene, your presence at each critical hour. And most importantly," he held up a clock set at 9:40, "your obsession with precision. You believed timing alone could hide your actions. Timing alone could control fate." Hastings, standing behind Poirot, finally understood. "So it's over? He can't escape now." Poirot turned to Eleanor March, nodding slightly. Thanks to your insights, mademoiselle, we understood the psychology, the motive, and the personal vendetta that drove him. Eleanor inclined her head quietly, and the little gray cells as always prevailed. Julian Vale slumped into a chair, defeated. Inspector Bell moved in silently, securing him. Poirot addressed the assembled company one final time. Let this be a lesson to all who believe that time can erase wrongdoing. Actions, however hidden, leave traces. And justice, though delayed, will always find a way. The little gray cells must observe, interpret, and act. But it is conscience that ensures the equilibrium of justice. He paused, looking at Hastings. Mon ami, even when doubt clouds the mind, observation, reflection, and the courage to act restore order. This, above all, is what separates reason from chaos. As the storm outside subsided, Ashcombe House seemed to exhale. The shadows receded. The fog lifted. The wrongs of the past had been confronted, the killer unmasked, and justice served. Poirot stood by the window, gazing at the quiet streets of London. His mind, as always, catalogued every detail, every subtle shift, every human emotion involved in the case. And though the danger had passed, he knew that the little gray cells would always remain vigilant, prepared for the next challenge, the next test of intellect, patience, and morality. Hastings came to his side. Well, Poirot, we did it. Poirot smiled, though the weight of responsibility lingered. Yes, Hastings. But remember, justice is never final. It is merely a balance maintained, moment by moment, through observation, judgment, and courage. And tonight, the balance has been restored. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the house felt at peace. The storm outside was gone, but inside, the echoes of careful calculation, revenge, and moral reckoning would linger forever. And Hercule Poirot, ever watchful, ever precise, had once again triumphed not merely by intellect, but by the quiet, relentless power of the little gray cells. End of Part 10, and the hidden Hercule Poirot mystery.